Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sensitive Podcast. I am your host, Kim Kimball, somatic leadership coach for highly sensitive women solopreneurs. And I am joined today by Liz. We have such a juicy conversation for you. I cannot wait to dive in. We're going to be talking about how your attachment styles really can show up in your client relationships as you are running your business. So, without further ado, I'm going to allow Liz to introduce herself and we can dive in.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Kim. I am so honored to be here today. Like Kim said, my name is Liz, and I am a dating and relationship coach for highly sensitive people. I also intertwine hypnotherapy in my work as well. And I actually previously started out really exclusively focusing on attachment styles. So I started working as a dating and relationship coach back in 2022, and my focus was really on anxious attachment. So I have a lot of knowledge in that space. I was certified in integrative attachment theory. So I know we're going to be diving into quite a bit of that today as well. And then also talking about the relationship between HSPs and attachment styles, because there's a lot of overlap there, and it's a really interesting subject to kind of dive into. So thank you, Kim, again for having me today, and I'm excited to chat.
Yeah, I'm so excited too. And um, some people who have followed my journey for a really long time may know this, but my niche used to be working with, I guess you could say, I don't know if I had even niched down to highly sensitives at that point, but working with people who their primary patterns were codependency, people pleasing. Um, I've done a lot of work on attachment myself and have a good bit of knowledge there, and that used to be sort of my main area of focus also. So I think between the two of us we're going to have rich conversation here. So um for those listening, I just want us to start out on an even playing field. Can you share a little bit with us about what attachment styles actually are?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way that I like to describe attachment styles is that it is a system of beliefs and corresponding behavioral patterns that come through when relating to others. So that I know sounds like a mouthful. We can definitely get into describing what the specifics look like there. But there are four attachment styles. So I'll start off by describing each one of them. The first is anxious. And so it's exactly what it sounds like. Anxious attachers are those that are driven by a need for closeness and intimacy, and it's really rooted in the belief of abandonment, the fear of abandonment, the fear of rejection. And then we have dismissive avoidance, who are on the other end of the spectrum. And dismissive avoidance are really driven by a need for space and independence. And all of that is really rooted in this fear of intimacy, this fear of closeness. So, of course, like the two of those together, as many people know, anxious and avoidance can have a little bit of an interesting relationship because their needs are so opposite. Then we have fearful avoidance, which is also known as disorganized. And that's really a combination of the two in certain ways, where fearful avoidance fluctuate between desiring that closeness and then desiring that independence. So it can be very confusing, very chaotic, both for the fearful avoidant as well as whoever they're relating to. And typically, fearful avoidance is actually rooted in a fear of betrayal, a lot of distrust, a lot of trust themes will come up there, but ultimately, really a lot of fear of safety. So there's often like a big lack of safety when it comes to someone who is fearful avoidant in the way that they relate to others. And then last but not least, the one that we're all striving to, of course, is secure. And with someone who is secure, if you are secure, really you have a positive belief about yourself as well as the others around you. So you are somebody who is comfortable with communication, intimacy. You generally have positive beliefs about the way that your partner or whoever you are relating with, whether it's a colleague, a client, a family member, is going to show up for you. There is trust in the relationship. There is generally a feeling of safety in the relationship, a lot of peace, stability, groundedness, and you can certainly be in a relationship where the other person is potentially an insecure attacher, but then you are secure, and that can overall create a secure dynamic for the two of you, as long as you really have that one who is secure in the relationship. And so, as I'm talking about these styles, of course, a lot of people think of attachment styles specifically in relation to romantic relationships. And if you're on social media, I'm sure you've seen a lot about attachment styles as it relates to dating and romantic partners. But like I alluded to, attachment styles show up in every single relationship. So, yeah, the way you relate to your family members, the way you relate to your friends, your colleagues, your clients. And you can have different attachment styles in different types of relationships. And it really has to do with your own unique beliefs about yourself and the other person in those contexts, as well as childhood programming for those different environments and different types of relationships.
Hmm. Yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to define that for us and obviously going into the specific types. Um, I love your definition, and I certainly think it's more thorough than the one I typically use. But the one I like to share with folks, just to also share another one, is attachment styles is how we typically respond in relationships when we're under stress. So it's like it's how when we feel stressed in relationships, how do we respond? Do we anxiously swoop in and I need to make everything better right now, right? Or do we kind of lean back and like, "Ooh, this is making me really need some space," you know? And of course, that's very oversimplified. But yeah, I just really like that thorough definition that you gave. And as well as you saying, I think that we can just exclusively think of this as, oh, well, this is what shows up in my romantic partnerships, or maybe I see some remnants of this in my friendships, but a lot of times we're not as aware of that even. And then I think it can come as a really big surprise when we get into our own business, like, oh, it's like whack-a-mole. It's showing up here as well. And here we go. And so I would love to hear the ways that you feel like attachment styles typically show up for business owners with client relationships, especially for highly sensitive folks.
Yeah, yeah. I love that you called that out of like, you might start a business and it's like, oh my gosh, like I thought I worked through some of my attachment style challenges and oh gosh, here they are again. And something I always like to offer is that, attachment styles are very fluid and we often like to think of ourselves as just having one attachment style. But in reality, we're all made up of really all the attachment styles. And typically we'll have one that perhaps we relate to the most. But I often see that within both romantic relationships and client relationships, those attachment styles can be fluid, again to your point, based on our stress levels, like the way that another person is behaving makes us respond in a certain way, and it could be a little bit more avoidant and it could be a little bit more anxious even in the same week. So I always like to offer, just like first and foremost, to really try not to label yourself, but rather to just like continue to reflect on, okay, like what's showing up for me in this moment? Like, how am I responding and behaving right now? And perhaps like what attachment style am I currently experiencing? So that was just a little bit of a side note, but yeah, in terms of a business, so I would say, what is really interesting, especially like for first time business owners, is like typically you're going to start your business and you're likely going to have like some imposter syndrome, right? Or like you're going to have like some level of self doubt, some level of like, you know, potentially like low self esteem, even around like your capabilities as a business owner. And so you're already kind of being put in that stress state, right? Like you're already probably a little bit dysregulated and again, doubtful about your own abilities. So this kind of already puts you into a space where you might relate to other people in a more insecure way. And so then, of course, we add clients into the mix, and it's really easy even if a client is showing up in, I would say like a very normal way per se, you start to kind of make up some stories in your head or start to like go into panic mode because of the way that you're feeling really about yourself as a new business
Mm.
owner. And so the reason I'm also bringing this up is because, like I said earlier, sometimes, we think, oh, we work through our insecure relating, or maybe it's like, yeah, like, in dating and relationships or the way that I function with my partner, I function in a very secure way. Well, most likely because you have beliefs about your, dating and relationship, your romantic life that, hey, like I'm worthy of this romantic partner. I feel really stable and secure with this person. I know how he's going to react. I know how he's going to respond. He's chosen me, especially if you're in something really stable. You can have those beliefs, then all of a sudden, again, you're in a new context and your beliefs completely shift. So I know that was kind of high level. And if we really dig into like what this looks like, if we think about somebody who is more on the anxious side, generally what I see that comes up a lot is like this, oh my gosh, this client hates me. This client is going to terminate the contract. This client doesn't like me. Oh no, like I didn't get positive feedback from them at the end of the session. Like I noticed that they had like their tone of voice changed. They had some like weird energetic shifts during this session. You start panicking, like, oh my gosh, what did I do wrong? You're freaking out. You're making stories up in your head. And that, leads to some of the coping mechanisms that we can go into. But it's all rooted in, right, this like fear of being rejected or being abandoned by the client, having them terminate the contract, or, even in the sales process, being like, this person's going to reject me. Like, this person doesn't want to work with me. They're going to choose somebody else. And so, again, if you're familiar with the the way that this, kind of shows up in romantic patterns, it's very similar, right? If you're dating somebody, to have some of those same thoughts, like, oh, he hates me. Like, he threw in a weird emoji into our text, or his tone of voice again changed. Like, he's going to leave me. He hates me. So it's all kind of the same thing in a different context. Meanwhile, if you had more of those avoidant patterns, the way that I see it typically showing up is this like, oh my gosh, I got to get out of here. Like, I am so overwhelmed. This is too much. This client is too much. I need to like create separation between me and this person. And if you are in a space where you're working with clients and more emotional subjects, I find this can certainly come up, right? Like, another person's emotions may really overwhelm somebody that has more of those avoidant tendencies, or potentially clients that might be on the more anxious side, that might be a little bit needier, might trigger that, like, oh, like, yeah, this is way too much communication. This is, they're emailing me too much. They're expecting too much of me. They are potentially, like, responding too quickly. I hear this sometimes, like, to my emails or to my messages. And so what happens is, yeah, that avoidant tendency comes out, and it leads to this desire to want to escape the situation or to create distance between you and the client. So I know that was a lot, so I'll just pause there and hear your thoughts.
Yeah, all of that just spot on. Yes, yes, yes. I have felt and experienced both. And I really love how you framed this at the very beginning of really recognizing that we all have all of the attachment styles within us, that it's not fixed, that it is very fluid, and to really resist this tendency of like, okay, what am I? Let me slap a label on myself and figure myself out. It kind of reminds me, are you familiar with the Enneagram, Liz?
Yes, I love the Enneagram.
I love that system so much, but I think that people, when they first discover that system, or maybe let's say human design, whatever, that you can get so fixated on, okay, what number am I, and what exactly does that mean? When, just as you're saying, the reality of the situation is we have all of the 9 numbers within us. And it's really this beautiful permission slip that I hear from you to allow ourselves to be fluid, allow ourselves to be dynamic, to resist needing to label ourselves, and to meet ourselves in our wholeness, which I ultimately want to encourage everybody to do, right? And it just gives you so much more freedom and flexibility, like you're saying, to check in with yourself. Oh, like, how am I showing up in this interaction? How am I showing up in this one? And just to get curious, and that curiosity can decrease any judgment that you're feeling towards yourself, because there can be this tendency to sort of beat ourselves up of like, oh, there I go again with my anxious attachment. It's showing up with my client again, and kind of getting down on ourselves. But just having that curiosity of how am I showing up in this relationship? And I love the distinction that you put as well of like, okay, maybe you think you've worked through this in your partnership, but this is a different scenario. And I often find, and I'm sure you find this as well, but like you said, maybe if there's imposter syndrome going on and there's different beliefs, that's going to amplify essentially insecurities, right? And I also find that monetary exchange amplifies insecurities in general, right? So when there's a romantic partnership, there's no monetary exchange there. There's none of that going on. And so when you add that in, where there has to be this perceived value exchange of, am I giving them enough value for the money that they're giving me? That can really amplify insecurities for folks. So just naming that, if you're experiencing that, so you can give yourself so much compassion that all of this is normal. And I always say to people, this is the whole point. Like, we look at stuff like this as, oh, I'm failing if this stuff comes up. This is a beautiful healing ground. It's like going a deeper layer of the onion of, okay, I've had the opportunity to heal some of these attachment wounds in my romantic partnerships and my friendships. And here's another layer where I'm adding another layer of like my value that I bring to the world, who I am as a person, my gifts that I'm giving and that monetary exchange involved. And instead of, if you have some stickiness with that, viewing it as a failure of some kind, viewing it as, okay, this is the learning school that I'm in right now. This is the whole point. Nothing has gone wrong. It's just an opportunity to heal a layer deeper. And that's all.
Yeah. Oh, so beautifully said. So many good nuggets in there. And, what came up for me as you were speaking was, this idea that if when we're in like the dating realm, we can very easily say, like, oh, I don't like these feelings that are coming out with this partner. Like he's not texting me frequently enough, or, maybe he's too overwhelming. I'm just going to bail. But when we're in a client container, we sign this agreement with them, perhaps like, we have a 6 month term with them, we kind of have to manage these things. We don't really have a choice. If we do have a choice, but the choice is that we're going to feel pretty bad, right? Either you're going to feel really overwhelmed or really panicky. And so what I found personally, even navigating some of these things as a business owner was, I got really good at stuff like setting boundaries and having tough conversations because in the early for the first time in my life, I really felt like I was forced to have these conversations in order for the relationship with the client to truly be productive on both sides.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that so much. Well, I know you alluded to this a little bit before, but I would love to dive into what you see as coping mechanisms for attachment wounds for business owners and their client relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I always say that humans have a very predictable way of responding to situation. Like it's almost amusing. You can put a human in a situation with, somebody who, for example, perhaps is angry and they're going to respond in a very predictable way every single time. And of course, these coping mechanisms were picked up during childhood. And like we chatted about a little bit already, like they are survival strategies. And so to your point earlier about having a lot of compassion, I always like to encourage people to just honor that part of themselves because in many cases, when we are responding in certain situations, when our coping mechanisms are coming up, it's just our inner child who's speaking up and doing what she knows best to do and what worked when she was 5 or 6 dealing with her parents. And so if you think about anxious tendencies, coping mechanisms on that side, I would say the biggest ones that I see, especially for highly sensitive people, are overgiving and people pleasing. Those are the two biggest ones. And, if we specifically think about what might that look like with a client with overgiving, what I often see is things like, going overtime in a session. And hey, I'm guilty of that. I remember I used to have sessions that would go over like 45 minutes because, to your point about the monetary exchange too, it's like, oh my gosh, like I'm feeling a little bit insecure in this relationship. I want to make sure they see my value. So I'm going to prove how valuable I am by giving them so much of myself. I also, worked with people who have mentioned that they, would give clients like extra PDFs or like they would, yeah, make all this like stuff for them on the side that would take them hours to create just to prove that they are a good practitioner, that they are, somebody who's valuable to work with. And then of course, people pleasing. I see people pleasing as certainly like an anxious and an avoidant tendency. I think it's one that shows up as just an overall insecure way of relating. But as a business owner, right, there are a lot of opportunities to have tough conversations. And often I see that people are withholding those tough conversations because they don't want to upset the client, especially a highly sensitive person who typically has a lot of empathy, someone who doesn't want to ruffle feathers, somebody who wants to really keep the peace because also conflict is dysregulating. Having somebody get angry or upset is so dysregulating and stressful that they withhold the truth. And of course, this is a huge disservice to the client because in so many cases, when you're working with the clients, like your job as a practitioner is to have the tough conversations, to point out behaviors in them, things that they're doing that perhaps are a bit unsavory, and perhaps even things that are within your relationship that aren't really functioning, that likely are also being mirrored in other relationships they have. So this one I find is like it's really tough to overcome because in the moment, right, we're people pleasing, we just go into fawn mode. Like we go straight into the heads, we disconnect from our bodies, and we're just like, oh my God, where do I start right now to make this client like me? I'm feeling threatened. I don't want to say the thing right now because I don't want to create the conflict. And so we just sometimes we're just like word vomiting things that actually we don't really mean to say. And so what I like to also always offer people is like have a lot of grace and compassion with those people pleasing tendencies because I find they are some of truly the most challenging to break because they are happening really truly in the moment when you're threatened and your body is going into freeze mode. Um, so yeah, that one I would say certainly, like I said, shows up on the avoidance side too. Some other avoidant coping mechanisms that I see are generally just they're avoiding having the tough conversations, again, similar to kind of some of those people pleasing tendencies, but then also just like creating distance between you and the client. And so perhaps you're feeling really emotionally overwhelmed during the session, like your body language might start to close off. You might be start to become a little bit colder or distant during the session. I even see people leaning back sometimes, like create distance between you and the client. And then after the session too, avoiding checking emails, avoiding getting back to the client, not wanting to look, like being like, oh my gosh, like they're going to say something that's crazy. I'm going to deal with this. So like, I'm just not going to look at all. I'm just going to let this sit for a while. And having a really challenging time to have that conversation with the client. If the client perhaps in some cases maybe is crossing boundaries and maybe that is why you're responding in those types of ways. So a lot of this sometimes it can be really challenging to kind of parse through because there are certain aspects that are, your own belief systems and survival mechanisms coming into play when you're actually not really under threat. And then also sometimes our attachment systems truly are pointing out something that we actually truly need to take action on, like in the case of an avoidant, often some boundary setting.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you did such a good job of painting the picture there. I'm sure so many people that are listening will be able to see themselves or in one or both in different instances, which is amazing. And I would love to dive straight into your recommendations for helping highly sensitive people navigate client relationships on the anxious and the avoidant side.
Yeah, yeah. I would say, like, first and foremost, like, one of the most important things to get acquainted with, especially if you are on the more anxious side, is what is the system of beliefs that I'm operating under? Like, how do I feel about myself in this context? What are the beliefs I have about myself, and what are the beliefs I have about other people? And so, if you're starting to realize, I have these beliefs that, like, I'm not valuable, I'm not worthy, I'm not good at this, I'm not good enough. Like, they're going to choose somebody else. Like they're not happy with me, really like the number one thing outside of having that awareness is to start to rewire those beliefs and start to choose a new set of beliefs. And this is like way easier said than done. A lot of times when I'm working with clients in the attachment realm, we're doing a lot of inner child healing and we're actually like going into that part of yourself and doing some of the subconscious work to truly shift those patterns, rewire your brain to actually hold on to that new set of beliefs. But because, not everyone's going to have access to me or a practitioner to do that work with them, something that you can do that's actually fairly easy and is going to sound so elementary is simply looking for evidence of the opposite. And so, if you have this like belief that I am not good enough as a practitioner, then what I would suggest doing is literally having a list, creating that list of all of the instances where you actually are good enough and are doing a great job and are excellent at what you do and writing those specific pieces down on the list and making them as specific as possible. Like this exact compliment, this exact thing that the client said, this moment in the session that I did a really good job doing XYZ, because the subconscious actually needs like this level of proof to believe that this is in fact the truth. So sometimes like people are just, saying these really vague affirmations like I am worthy, I am good enough. And it's like that is not enough. Like that is not enough for so many reasons. Um, but what can be helpful is again, like having those lists and putting them somewhere where you can see and being really consistent with adding to those, literally all of the time. And then the second piece I would really encourage people to reflect on is to challenge every story that comes up are these insecure thoughts. So just noticing when you're saying something to yourself that maybe isn't quite true. And so I talked about this a little bit earlier around this idea of potentially feeling like, oh my God, my client hates me. She didn't say anything at the end of the session. It was a little awkward. Oh no, I did something wrong. Like, okay, let's take a breath and actually consider, is that actually true? And I often encourage people to question what else might be going on there? What's an alternative? This was something that I really struggled with personally as a practitioner, especially earlier on in my career, and especially because I was doing hypnosis and hypnotherapy on people. And so often what would happen is they would be at a loss for words after this session. Like they wouldn't have much to say to me. They would be like so kind of like almost in space. And I would be like, oh no, they hated it. Like I did such a bad job. But in reality, what was the truth? The alternative perspective there is like, no, they were just a little bit like overwhelmed by the experience itself and they're just processing and integrating. And you can even ask yourself too, like, put yourself into their shoes. Like, how might I respond in that situation? Like, I don't always say like thank you and give my practitioner all these words of affirmation after an amazing session together. So continuing to like really challenge every story, like get together with a friend if you need to and share it with them and see what alternative perspectives that they can come up with as well. And then in terms of some of like the more like actionable like coping mechanisms, how to overcome. So with people pleasing, one thing that I recommend is because sometimes we can be so unaware in the moment itself, is after the session, really just taking a moment to think through and reflect. When did I people please during the session? When did I withhold the truth? When did I not actually say what I meant? What did I say to get this person to like me? What did I say to get this person to feel good about themselves? And just kind of do that little inventory with yourself and notice like what was occurring in the session that led you to that people pleasing moment. Is there a certain type of client that you people please around? So I'll share vulnerably that I really struggled with clients that had this like really strong, powerful energy. It would often like put me in this really small, scared place where I was like, I need to impress them. And so I noticed that dynamic with that type of energy was putting me into this people pleasing space. And so having that awareness itself was really helpful for me. Frankly, that's also one of the reasons why I work with highly sensitive people because they typically don't have that energy. And that's just who I am most aligned to work with, really. But it was also, it was a good moment for me to really challenge myself to again notice, have the awareness, and then, okay, how can I potentially show up differently next time? What would I have said in that moment instead of people pleasing? What would have been a better thing to say? Um, and then another one that I would say, kind of in that realm of like boundaries and overgiving, what I would say there too is like really like have a plan for yourself of what is actually like acceptable for you and what is not. Like and know that like it's okay to be flexible sometimes like with our boundaries and moments that maybe we do want to go a little bit above and beyond, but kind of have that just framework for yourself of like, okay, like I am okay going over sessions by like 5 to 10 minutes, but I'm not going to go over by 45 minutes, right? Like just know kind of like what those like loose boundaries are, what your edges are. And similarly, if we think about like firm boundaries with communication, thinking about, okay, like what actually feels good for me in terms of how much I can communicate in between sessions. Like, what are my boundaries there? I know a lot of entrepreneurs, practitioners, coaches will have no boundaries with communication initially. They'll be like, you can reach out to me anytime you want, 24 hours a day, like I'm here for you. I'm going to respond, as quick as I can. No, like, don't go into it like that. Really think through, like, what's reasonable for me. And I know personally for me, that was 2 days a week of being available to clients for that support in between sessions. And I check Boxer, the audio messaging app, 2 times a day. And just being really clear with clients of like, hey, like, this is what my container is. This is what my process is. Here's why, even if you want to share a little bit about the why. And then allowing them to also make the decision of, okay, does that feel good for me or not? But as long as you're really clear about those expectations and boundaries up front, it helps to stay accountable within yourself and also stay accountable the other person as well, right? And again, they have the choice of whether they want to accept those boundaries. In some cases, when I was working with more anxious clients, they didn't want to accept those boundaries. And so they left. And that was okay with me because I knew as a practitioner really like what I was available to hold. So, anyways, I just went on for a long time. I'm gonna pause. Yeah.
Yeah, I love all those techniques. I think they're all so important. I will just add in one of my own because I tend to be in case it's helpful for anyone, I tend to be really somatically focused. And so even just noticing on a body level of, okay, let's say this anxiety rises up in me in a client interaction, like where do I feel that in my body? Can I describe it? How does it feel? Describing it and being with it in as much detail as possible. And then can I simultaneously find safety? And it's really starting to rewire, right? Of like, even though this anxiety is here, I'm actually safe in this moment. And retraining ourselves, right? That, okay, this anxiety can be here, and it also doesn't mean that I'm being life threatening chased by a bear, right? And so we can find that safety. At first, it might be that we find the safety externally by orienting practices, like by turning our head very slowly, looking around the room, orienting, showing ourselves there is no bear, right? Or just finding something pleasant to look at using our five senses. And then we can start to find safety internally eventually, right? Of safety. Okay, where is a place in my body, even though I have this anxiety maybe in my chest or in my throat or in my stomach, like actually my thighs feel pretty neutral. Can I focus on those sensations, the neutrality there, and can I hold that dual awareness of I can feel the anxiety here, but I've got the neutrality here, and I can actually focus on both of those and know that even though this is here, I'm safe in the moment. Um, so just want to add that into all of the beautiful, wonderful practices that you already shared. The cognitive flexibility that you shared, I think, is so important, right? Of what else might be possible. Like, sure, it might be possible that they hated the session, or it could be that they were really busy, or that they were blown away at how amazing it was, and they were at a lack for words, or they were kind of like you were saying in that hypnotherapy, sort of just a little bit cloudy, spacey, dissociated, haven't fully landed back in my body. There are endless possibilities, and so what else might be possible, you know? I love all of that, and I think just the one piece I want to add too is what you're sharing about the people pleasing and that being so hard to break. Yes, as I said, that has been one of the primary focuses of my entire career. And I think people can beat themselves up so much that they don't recognize it and identify it until afterwards. That's a huge thing that I see with clients. And I just want to encourage folks that are listening, even if you identified it sooner, afterwards, or identified it at all, like show yourself and give yourself compassion for whatever progress you have, right? Even if it's, oh gosh, I identified this, I noticed myself slipping into this a little bit earlier and sooner, right? Any step towards more awareness around this pattern is tremendous and huge, and celebrate that, right? So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Beautiful. I love those add-ins. And I think the somatic piece too is so important, like especially for highly sensitive people, because they're taking in so much that sometimes they lose touch with their bodies altogether. And they need that moment of kind of slowing down. And it's like, okay, I can still listen, right? I can still be present with the client while also being present with my body too, and just kind of noticing, like, okay, my feet on the ground still? Like, what is going on, internally for me? What is my internal landscape right now? And I think it often takes like that extra layer of like conscious awareness to keep on like checking in with yourself in those moments, because it is so easy in a session to go into your head, especially when you're newer in the role and you're still thinking about, okay, what did maybe I ask next? Like, where are we going here? What's the direction? Again, like, oh, they just had that shift. What did that shift mean in their voice or their body language? Like you're thinking so much that it is really lose touch. It's easy to lose touch with yourself.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Well, I would love to talk about what you see as being possible with the client as you heal your attachment wounds. Like, what would the type of relationship potentially look like and feel like when you reach that place?
Yeah. Yeah. I don't think it's like so dissimilar to other secure relationships that you have in your life. Of course, like with different boundaries per se, a different dynamic. But ultimately, really what it looks like is you have positive beliefs about yourself and the other person, which creates that trust, that access for vulnerability, for direct communication and reception on both sides. So you can receive feedback from them. You can also share feedback to them. And there is a knowingness and a belief that that feedback is coming from, a place of love and a place of safety and a place for truly like wanting the best for one another. And of course, like I was sharing earlier, it actually only really takes sometimes one person to create that dynamic. So as long as you are secure, even if the client is maybe a little anxious or avoidant, you can create that secure dynamic for the two of you by modeling it. I would say that in general, it's a relationship where there is, again, mutual respect of boundaries and just kind of a general, I would say, ease and safety. So being in a client session and actually feeling like, oh, I can actually relax. Like I'm not in my head. I'm in my full body. I'm in my truth. I'm in my wisdom. I'm able to channel during the session. If you do things like that, I'm able to really tap into my intuition and provide insights from my heart and, my intuitive abilities and not just from my head and what I think that I need to say to win this client over, to make them happy, to make sure that they are impressed with the way the session was conducted. And I think that as we all can probably reflect on having relationships that were potentially like that more naturally, right? Like some of those relationships are going to be easier to cultivate than others. And so, once again, it's just kind of noticing, okay, with the relationships that maybe don't feel that much ease, that I do feel like, ooh, I need to really like think a lot during the session. I need to really think about what to say next. Just noticing that, right? And inviting yourself to get curious about why that is and how maybe you can show up differently in the session in order to cultivate a little bit more of that security between the two of you.
Mm. I would the word that I use to describe everything that you just shared is sovereignty.
Mhm.
They have a different word for it, but that is the word that I use that encompasses everything that you shared for me, at least, of like the ability to show up. Of course, we're speaking specifically about client relationships here, in your client relationships as sovereign, to sovereignly hold the container. Um, it is the most beautiful, freeing, stabilizing, grounding, truly expansive experience. I wish it for everyone that is listening to this. I was thinking about certain client relationships and experiences I've had that are like what you shared. And I remember thinking of like, okay, I think that I am really getting to like this very sovereign place in my coaching when my client started bringing to me and letting me know when they were mad at me. And they were able to share with me, I didn't like that response that you gave me, or this triggered me in this way when you said this, or like, oh, I don't know about this or whatever. And really being able to dig into those conversations and not get triggered at all and not wobble and not say, oh, I've done something wrong, but like to be able to look back and forth of what is this bringing up in you and what is this bringing up in me and how can we be honest about it and how can we sort of hold this container together in a grounded way. I think so much healing can happen specifically for the client in a scenario like that when you are sovereignly holding a container. And that's really what I was thinking about as you were sharing that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's gorgeous. I love what you just shared there. And yeah, it reminds me too that, it's really, I think it's a beautiful opportunity for the practitioner to invite the client into doing things like that. I don't know, how you exactly cultivated that, but for me, because I was working with people, of course, that were insecurely attached, like I would actually ask them in certain scenarios, like, when did you people please me during this session today? And like giving them the opportunity to speak up because I mean, when do they ever get opportunities like that in other relationships? Like probably zero times. And, very similar to what you said too. Like when are they getting opportunities to speak up about not feeling good about something, being upset or angry or hurt? Um, Not very often in many people's cases.
Yeah. I got chills when you shared that. And I would invite any and all practitioners that are listening to this to think about how you can weave this into your onboarding practice, into your client sessions, into your follow-up emails, like how can you start weaving things like this into your containers essentially? Because I truly believe, as just as Liz is talking about, that these can be some of the most healing experiences, because if you're a safe person to bring these types of things up with, they are experientially learning, like, oh, sometimes it's okay to bring up my fears, to bring up these insecurities to another person, and the relationship didn't explode. Like, I didn't die. Um, in fact, there's more intimacy and vulnerability and connection between us now, and I feel pretty good. And it's like putting a deposit into the bank for them, right? Of like, here's an experience where sharing these things was met with safety and connection. And like Liz is sharing, you might be one of the only or first experiences of that, and just how powerful that can be. So, how can you actually start thinking about how can I intentionally weave this into my containers? Can be so powerful.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, I love that. And yeah, it is really wild. You know, people will come to, I'm sure you and I, with like certain issues outside of course, our container, like within their lives that they want to solve for. And in reality, to your point, some of the greatest healing and some of the greatest insights actually come through the relationship between the practitioner and you. I had a specific example where a client, you know, she was crossing my boundaries a little bit with voice notes after I'd already shared, like, hey, this is kind of the framework that I use. And I just really gently reset the boundary with her, you know, explained why and all of that. And she told me at the end of our container, you setting boundaries with me in a way that felt really heart centered, but also firm and confident was actually like the greatest medicine for me in this entire process because I got to witness and role model what that actually looked like. And I got to realize that even though I crossed your boundaries, like we were okay on the other side. So it is just, I think it's like an overlooked aspect of working with a client. And clients, of course, like that's not how you're going to sell your process or your work with clients, but it is such a added benefit that truly, in many cases, yeah, is the most powerful part of the container.
That's exactly what I was going to say. I think being able to reach this place of sovereignty, of being in your own center and holding that in your client calls, in your containers, honestly can be the most powerful part of your work. 1,000%. So I love this little rabbit trail that we took. I think it's so, so important. And I know we've talked a lot about attachment styles, obviously, and attachment related challenges, but what other challenges do you think that highly sensitive people experience with client relationships?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one that a lot of people are very familiar with is just highly sensitive people's tendency to be very empathic and to pick up a lot of the energy and to absorb a lot of the energy during a session. And of course, a lot of highly sensitive people, like they go into very emotionally charged spaces. That's what often in many cases they're so good at being compassionate and validating and understanding and talking about these really deep emotional challenges. And at the same time, their Achilles heels, yeah, they take on all of it. They take it on after the session. And I think a lot of us are very familiar with that. And frankly, I think that's sometimes why highly sensitive people decide to no longer be in that space or they decide to pivot their career. They're like, it is too much, which is a shame in so many cases. So I'm sure you have some tactics as well, but um, I always really invite highly sensitive people to consider like, what is that self care practice that I'm going to commit to after sessions? Or, you know, if I notice that like I am like so overwhelmed and taking on so much, like, are there certain like boundaries again that I need to put in place? Like, are the sessions too long? Like, is it too much? You know, I used to do like 2 hour sessions. I was like,
Oh,
so
wow.
much. It was too much energy. So I decided 60 minutes is a perfect amount of time for me. And even when I'm holding workshops as well, like I decided I can't really do a workshop over 60 minutes because it's too much that I kind of I absorb, right? Just inherently.
Yeah, knowing those boundaries. I always say, I think one of the biggest things that you can do as a highly sensitive person is to stop treating yourself as though you're not one. And so if you just believed yourself that I am a highly sensitive person and that my energetic needs, my picking up on energy, my empathic abilities, my ability to take in 40% more information than the rest of the population, which is what we have shown, is actually happening and the reason for the overwhelm and the increased burnout and all that stuff, if I actually just believed myself, what boundaries would I put in place? If I was no longer negotiating against myself, how would I set this up? You know, and running our own businesses, we have the incredible privilege that we can ask ourselves those questions and actually accommodate ourselves, right? We're no longer in a workplace where it's like, well, I don't care what your highly sensitive nature is, you've just got to do the thing. And yet a lot of us carry that mentality from corporate 9 to 5, whatever, and we continue to impose it on ourselves in our own businesses and don't actually just believe ourselves, don't believe our sensitivities, don't actually accommodate who we actually are. So invitation to set boundaries that actually accommodate and support who you really are and set up your business accordingly.
Oh, so true. And I was thinking, if you know, another example of obviously overstimulation comes up a lot. And I know practitioners who, because they're so sensitive and they get overstimulated, they're like, I'm not doing video calls. I only do phone calls with clients, or I do just, cameras off, because I'm already taking in so much information that it's too much for me to also take in the image of them. I'm getting enough already through just their voice. And it's like, that's okay. If you are just as effective, or in many cases, I think more effective by doing things like that, that you're right. In the corporate world, when I had my corporate job, it was videos on all the time. There was no just audio. It was always video. And I would be on video call sometimes like 6 hours a day. And of course, it's like at the end of the day, your
Yeah.
brain is like blowing up as a highly sensitive person. So you're right. Like, how beautiful is it that you have the opportunity to decide what works for you and what doesn't work for you as a highly sensitive person, and to continue to consider ways that you can reduce that overstimulation, because that is a challenge, right? Like, highly sensitive people, if they operate like everyone else, they are going to burn out, right?
Yeah,
So
exactly.
yeah.
Yeah, it's so funny. I had almost forgotten about that. I operated by phone only in my coaching calls. Gosh, how long? At least 3 or 4 years in my coaching business. Maybe even longer, maybe 5. I think it may have been 5. Um, in my coaching business, and I think it actually finely tuned you even more to even more subtleties in somebody's voice or shift of energy or things like that. And you get to think outside of the box. Like right now, a lot of my one-on-one coaching I do asynchronously, which I get to weave into my day. I don't have to be butt in chair at a specific time, which is great for myself and the client. There's no video involved. It's voice memo or text back and forth. Like permission to think outside of the box and do what works for you and for your energy, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah, it is, it's one of those things you have to be really intentional about, because it's really easy, I think, when you're first starting your business, just to like get all the practices from successful business owners. And then as you experiment and you realize like, this is not serving me, like, take control of that, and honor yourself. That's just what I tell people again and again. Keep honoring yourself. That's the best thing you can do.
Yeah, that's it. Well, another aspect of being a highly sensitive person, I think, is just this tendency to be really self-critical. And how does that impact client relationships that you've seen?
Oh boy. Oh boy. Yeah. Oh my gosh. I mean, it's so interesting because, yeah, HSPs, because they're picking up on all the subtleties, they're picking up on all the subtleties in their own behaviors too. So they have so much reflection after each session that in many cases has a really negative lens. And that negative lens turns into self-criticism. And the amusing thing in many cases is that the client probably had an entirely different experience than you did. They were probably not picking up on any of those little subtleties that you were picking up on. And it's frankly, yeah, kind of amusing in many cases how different their perception might be of yours. So I think first, like, just grounding yourself in that alone. But then I really do think it's so important, as elementary as it sounds, you are your own boss. And so you need to consciously be looking for those moments where you did a really excellent job. And again, like I was sharing earlier, you need to write them down. And this needs to be like the most important part of you as a business owner with yourself, because hey, you don't have somebody who's giving you positive feedback. And I know for me, that was one of the most challenging adjustments coming from the corporate world going into owning my own business because I did have bosses and colleagues that were constantly giving me positive affirmation. And when that was suddenly all went away and the only person I had was myself and my clients to affirm me, I realized like, oh gosh, like I'm losing a lot of that positive feedback and it's just all critical. And when you're kind of in that cycle of criticism, that is also right what leads to that burnout and it leads to your own energy and vitality dropping. And the truth is like that affects your client relationships too, because the energy you bring into a session is in some cases more important than the words that you're saying, right? Like, that's the other like underrated aspect of working with a coach or a practitioner or any business owner is that, yeah, like they can give you skills and tactics, but as a practitioner, when you are showing up in your highest energy, again, you are role modeling what it looks like to be grounded and peaceful and secure and confident and happy and all those things. That is something that many times your client is absorbing and is what often leads to being like, wow, like I love working with this person. I feel so good around this person. I'm sure if we reflect on experiences that we've had with practitioners, there are those certain practitioners you can feel they're just so grounded in themselves, so grounded in their worth that you feel good being around them. You feel inspired to be around them and it allows you to have the courage to take action in your life that you need to show up in that way too.
Yes, 1,000%. What you're sharing is precisely the reason I have a membership called The Sanctuary, and it's precisely the reason why I have us focus on wins. Because a lot of times it's really uncomfortable for folks, and they're not used to actually what is going well, and how can I actually give myself some celebration, some praise? How can I flip the script on just examining what isn't going well in order to optimize it or whatever, and how can I actually take in what is going well, and that context that you're giving of okay, in our other jobs and things we're used to receiving that from somewhere to somewhat balance out the negative internal self-talk that we're having, and then we switch into our business ownership and it's like all I've got is like a main line coming towards me of all of my negative self-talk, and that is balanced out by nothing, right? I think that really helped to hit home the importance of that. So thank you for that. Yeah,
Yeah,
context to that.
totally. I think it's really interesting, like working with highly sensitive people, something that I've noticed is that they actually don't really need a lot of like feedback from me on how they can show up differently. So of course, like I'm working in the dating realm. In reality, like what I've noticed, like most highly sensitive people are actually doing like a lot right. And what they actually need is just a lot of encouragement,
Yeah.
somebody to reflect back their gift and their magic. And that's something that, if for people that are non-sensitive and aren't as self-aware, perhaps do have some like big areas of opportunity, especially with things like emotional maturity, like they may need like much more of a stronger push, but generally HSP clients don't need that type of like really strong push or like criticism or feedback. They're already doing it to themselves. And so just, remind yourself that, yeah, you're already giving yourself a lot of that. So also seeking out whether it's like friends, maybe if you do have other people that are in like the entrepreneurial business space that you can connect with, if you can actually ask your friends and your colleagues to give you positive feedback and support. And actually, what I've had to do is actually limit, like tell people like, hey, I can't, I don't want the criticism. I don't want the feedback. Thank you so much. Right. And saying, and of course, I totally understand you're trying to help, but actually what would be really supportive for me and my business right now is for you to just offer support and any positive affirmations and feedback you could possibly give me.
And that's a boundary within itself, right? Of knowing what you need at the moment and being able to actually ask for what it is you need.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you touched on this a moment ago in what you shared, and I think we focused a lot, and rightfully so, to help people overcome the challenges, but the different challenges of being a highly sensitive person and owning your own business. But there are so many gifts, and there are so many strengths to being a highly sensitive person. And I'm curious how you feel that highly sensitive people may be able to tap into those more and maximize the client experience and results as a result of that.
Yeah. I would say one of the biggest pieces is to really sharpen and tap it into your intuition, because highly sensitive people often have a really strong intuition. And again, yeah, they're picking up all those subtleties. They are connecting the dots. They are noticing all of the little micro shifts in clients. And rather than feeling like, okay, I need to stick to this like really rigid framework of coaching or showing up in a session, I need to do like this, and this, because maybe this is what I learned at my certification. Maybe this is, yeah, what I was told to do, because in our traditional like educational systems, there's very much kind of these frameworks that we're supposed to be using. Actually trust that your intuition is your greatest gift to the client, and your ability to be taking in all of that information and then using it to guide the client as they need to, again, reflect back things that you're noticing, things that you're picking up on. Often, like that is when the biggest breakthroughs happen. Like sometimes I would find like just talking to a client is again pointing out like, hey, I noticed that your voice dropped when you shared that. And I feel like this is actually important to dig into. Whereas, maybe initially I had a different plan. Like follow that instinct, follow what you're noticing. That is again, often nobody has ever actually reflected things back to the client like that. And that is, I mean, it's a huge gift. Uh, and then I think, we talk a lot about just in general, highly sensitive people are, of course, like incredibly compassionate, incredibly empathetic, incredibly have an incredible skill to be very validating. And I have found that often, again, that's like what people need the most, is to be heard and to be seen and to be validated and understood. And once again, like sometimes we think, okay, all these strategies and tactics, this is what I'm supposed to like tell this person to do in order to get X result. In so many cases, just being seen in your pain, being seen in your success, being seen just in this moment, which you are so equipped to do as a highly sensitive person, is such a huge gift to give another person. So just relax into your natural abilities and your natural instincts, rather than rising into your head of like, oh, this is what I think that I should be doing to be a good practitioner.
Mm. I love that so much. This conversation has been so rich, and I'm sure that we could continue to talk for a very long time. But I'm going to try to land this plane. I love to just close with a few rapid fire questions, if that's okay with you. I always tell people you don't have to think about these too long and hard. Just whatever first comes to your mind. Does not have to be a long, lengthy answer. Just meant to be fun and to allow my audience and yours to get to know you a little bit better. Is there anything that you'd like to say in closing that feels like it needs another moment to wrap up from our podcast today, first of all?
Mhm. I think just the last thing that I always like to emphasize is that truly like being highly sensitive is such a superpower. And it's really challenging when you have all this program and grew up to believe that your sensitivity is actually something that should be kind of shut down or repressed. But in reality, I think we're actually in a really beautiful time where highly sensitive people are starting to come into the spotlight, because there is so much more education, like what you're doing and what I'm doing too, to highlight all of the gifts and the strength of a highly sensitive person. And I really just think the world right now more than ever needs more sensitive people to come to center stage. And so, we want to hear you. We want to hear your voice. We want to see you. You matter. And if, I'm sure that your content as well as my content, right, it gives people a lot of understanding of some of those gifts. But if I were you, I would go down a rabbit hole in all of the books about being highly sensitive, because they really kind of give you that little boost of encouragement and self-love that many highly sensitive people really deeply need to succeed and to use their sensitivity again as their superpower.
Mm, love that. What do you wish people knew about your experience as a highly sensitive person in the world?
Ooh, I I feel like I wish, I mean, this is going to go kind of into the dating realm, because that's what I focus my work on. But I wish that people understood how much more successful I was in romantic relationships when I decided my sensitivity is coming forefront. In fact, like saying on first dates, like I'm a highly sensitive person. And my man, the reason why we actually connected was because on the second date, he told me he was highly sensitive. And I was like, oh my gosh, like this person, the fact that he even has that language and that he understands what that is and can resonate and understand me, that feels so good. And so it's similar to what I was saying earlier, but to not hide that you're sensitive because it's what allows you to often connect with other people that are also equally sensitive. A lot of times with highly sensitive people are, they're a little bit shyer, a little bit more introverted or reserved. And I know I was, so I often wasn't somebody who necessarily initiated as much and again put things like that in the forefront. But yeah, get it out there because for me, I think like that was such a game changer in my romantic relationships, my friendships too. Being really honest with like, hey, I'm sensitive and oh my gosh, you are too. Wow. Now we can like deep dive this together and we can encourage each other and again, like really allow each other to shine.
Mm, I love that. What is the last thing that truly surprised you?
Oh my gosh, the last thing that surprised me. Ooh, it's probably, I mean, this is so silly. This is something that comes to mind though, is just that my boyfriend sent me The Artist's Way and I wasn't expecting it. It was just really sweet. And yeah, it's just like little gifts like that, right? Just like it's so nice to have those little moments where people are thinking about you. And I just wasn't expecting anything in the mail. It came a couple days ago. So
I love
so
that, and he has great taste.
he does. He does.
Yeah, I love that. What consistently brings you deep joy?
Hmm. I would say certainly like traveling is probably my biggest thing. I'm really like seeing new sights, being exposed to new people, new places, seeing beauty and, seeing being in nature. I think truly a lot of the travel that I do is like very intertwined with being in nature and then just being in like beautiful restaurants and like having like a lovely meal and a lovely glass of wine with somebody who I'm close to. I'm like, those are the things that light me up and make me so happy.
All right. Well, you and I need to get together somewhere in the world because it sounds like we would really, really jive because those are all my favorite things as well. So no real surprise as highly sensitive people. So well, thank you so much for your time, for sharing your wisdom. This has been such a nourishing and rich conversation. There is so much here, and I just really enjoyed it.
Likewise. Thank you so much, Kim.
Absolutely.